They left to find freedom, but landed in chaos. 66 days of storm, death, and division. What really happened in 1620? Forget the fairy tales. This is the brutal, political, and astonishingly human story behind the Mayflower, the Compact, and the myth of America's first Thanksgiving. They called it the First Thanksgiving, a harvest feast shared between peaceful pilgrims and noble natives. A new world was born in gratitude, harmony, and God's grace, or so we were told. But history, real history, rarely fits into parables. The Mayflower story has become one of America's foundational myths, a tale of religious freedom, democratic beginnings, and friendly cooperation with indigenous neighbors. For centuries, this version has been retold in school plays, national holidays, and presidential speeches. Pilgrims with buckled hats, Squanto, the translator, turkey and prayer beneath the falling leaves of New England. And yet, virtually none of this happened the way we imagine. The true story of 1620 is far more complex and far more human. It is a tale not just of piety and survival, but of political division, desperation, theft, and uneasy alliances. It is the story of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, shaped by fear, hunger, ambition, and chance. And it begins not with a feast, but with a crisis. The idea of the Mayflower as a sacred beginning didn't emerge in 1620. It didn't even emerge in the 1600s. The first national references to the Pilgrims didn't appear until the 1800s, more than 2 centuries after the voyage. The word itself wasn't commonly used for the Mayflower passengers until long after most of them were dead. In 1863, during the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln proclaimed Thanksgiving a national holiday. In doing so, he borrowed fragments from a regional New England tradition and gave it national weight. This was no accident. A fractured nation needed origin stories in a time of bloody division. The tale of pilgrims and natives sharing a meal provided a comforting image of unity. Writers, ministers, and politicians seized on the moment. In the years that followed, textbooks, paintings, and speeches elevated the Mayflower passengers from settlers to saints. The Mayflower Compact was hailed as the first democratic constitution. The feast became an emblem of gratitude. The struggles were softened, the violence buried. What emerged was not just a myth, it was a usable past, a founding story that made Americans feel righteous, chosen, and benevolent. But this version left out more than it included. The actual Mayflower passengers were not monolithic. About 40 of the 102 people aboard were English separatists, Protestants who had fled to the Dutch Republic seeking religious freedom. But the rest? Farmers, tradespeople, indentured servants, and hired hands. Some were investors hoping for land and profit. Others were escaping debt or seeking adventure. These were not saints. They were survivors. They argued. They got sick. Some died before even reaching land. They also stole from indigenous graves and food stores, shot at strangers, and split bitterly over how they should govern themselves. Their voyage was not marked by divine clarity, but by legal confusion and near mutiny. And yet, by the 19th century, these same people had been transformed into sacred founders. Why? Because they offered something American society craved, the idea of moral beginnings. While the South told its own origin story through Jamestown, a colony founded in 1607 by gentlemen and fortune seekers, later stained by slavery and class warfare. New England needed a counter-narrative. The Mayflower provided one. It was Northern, Protestant, family-oriented, and rooted in struggle rather than greed. In the competition for America's soul, Plymouth beat Jamestown, not in fact, but in memory. But in lifting the Mayflower passengers into sainthood, something else was lost, namely, everyone who didn't fit the narrative. The Wampanoag, whose lands were decimated by European disease before the Pilgrims ever arrived, became supporting characters in their own homeland. Squanto, real name Tisquantum, was reduced to a noble helper, stripped of his trauma as a former captive and his political shrewdness. The women aboard the Mayflower, many of whom died in the first winter, were nearly erased. Their names rarely appear in early accounts. Their suffering, labor, and resilience didn't make it into the textbooks. Even among the English, class lines vanished in the myth. Servants and indentured men who signed the Mayflower Compact were recast as equals in a harmonious republic. In reality, they remained bound by hierarchy, labor contracts, and unequal access to power. The Mayflower Compact itself was later interpreted as a proto-constitution, an early example of American democracy. But the truth is far less romantic. It was a hasty, improvised agreement to prevent rebellion when the settlers realized they had landed far outside the bounds of their legal charter. It was a pact born of chaos, not idealism. Historical myths don't last because they're true. They last because they're helpful. In the late 1800s, as waves of Catholic and Jewish immigrants arrived in American cities, Protestant elites used the Pilgrim myth to assert a native moral identity. The Mayflower became a symbol of what real Americans looked like: white, English, Protestant, and agrarian. The Thanksgiving story smoothed over colonial violence and suggested that cooperation, not conquest, defined America's origin. Even today, the story lingers. Politicians evoke the Mayflower to celebrate American exceptionalism. Children dress in pilgrim hats and paper feathers. Few are told about the stolen food, the grave robbing, the mass deaths, or the fractured motives of those on board. But understanding what really happened in 1620 doesn't make the story less inspiring. It makes it more human. It shows us how people, messy, scared, hopeful people, built something amid chaos. It reminds us that democracy, however fragile, is often born in desperation. And it forces us to reckon with the costs of survival. Who pays, who benefits, and who gets remembered. This documentary is not about tearing down the past. It's about uncovering it. In the chapters to come, we will follow the Mayflower passengers across the Atlantic, through storms, disease, political breakdown, and the bleak shore of Cape Cod. We'll walk with them through the freezing winter, the fragile diplomacy with indigenous nations, and the uneasy birth of a colony. We'll examine the true motives of the leaders, the legal gray zones they navigated, and the compromises they made, not for glory, but to avoid collapse. And we will listen to the voices so often ignored, the native peoples watching from the tree line, the women laboring in silence, the children who buried their parents. Because the real story of 1620 isn't about a perfect beginning. It's about a flawed one, and that makes it far more powerful. Before the Mayflower ever touched the sea, its story began in fire, religious fire, political fire, the fire of rebellion and suppression. To understand why a group of Englishmen and women risked everything to cross a deadly ocean, we must first return to a kingdom boiling with tension: England in the early 1600s. The official narrative says the Pilgrims sought religious freedom. That's partly true. But freedom in that era was inseparable from power. And what they truly sought wasn't just to worship, it was to build a new world in their image. In 1603, James VI of Scotland inherited the English throne, becoming King James I. His rise brought hope to many, but for the growing number of radical Protestants known as Puritans, it quickly turned to dread. The Church of England, Anglican in name, Catholic in flavor, was the only legal church. Its rituals still resembled Rome: ornate garments, kneeling at altars, hierarchical bishops. To Puritans, these were not just corruptions, they were blasphemy. They demanded a simpler, purer worship, closer to what they believed Scripture commanded. But within this radical reform movement, another faction emerged, more dangerous in the eyes of the crown. These were the Separatists. Where Puritans hoped to cleanse the existing church from within, Separatists gave up entirely. They wanted nothing to do with state-controlled religion. They met in secret, held illegal services, baptized outside official channels, and refused to bow to bishops. This wasn't just heresy, it was treason. In England, church and state were one. To defy the church was to challenge the king. And under James I, the state struck back. Dissenters were fined, imprisoned, harassed, or worse. Surveillance increased. Informants were everywhere. A whispered psalm in the wrong home could lead to arrest. For the Separatists, the pressure became unbearable. Around 1607, a group of Separatists in the village of Scrooby, Nottinghamshire, decided to flee England entirely. Their destination, the Dutch Republic, one of the few places in Europe where religious tolerance, at least in practice, was a way of life. But even leaving England was illegal. Unauthorized emigration was considered desertion. The Crown feared not only the loss of laborers, but also the spread of radical ideas abroad. The Separatists' first attempts to flee failed. They were betrayed, captured, and imprisoned. But eventually, in small groups, they escaped to Holland. By 1609, many had settled in the city of Leiden. There, under the leadership of Pastor John Robinson, the community began to rebuild. They worked humble jobs, textile work, carpentry, brewing, and worshipped freely. But life in Leiden was not easy. The English were poor, often discriminated against, and lived complex lives in a foreign tongue. Worse, the children of these English exiles were beginning to adopt Dutch culture, Dutch clothes, Dutch language, Dutch habits. For parents like William Bradford, this was a creeping loss of identity. A new fear emerged, not just of persecution, but of assimilation. They had escaped religious tyranny, but in doing so, they were losing something else: their Englishness. In 1617, after nearly a decade in exile, the Leiden Separatists began discussing a radical idea: not to return to England, but to build a new society across the sea. A place untouched by kings and bishops. A place where they could worship, govern, and raise their children as they saw fit. But vision alone wouldn't carry them across the Atlantic. They needed money, ships, supplies, and a legal right to settle. Here's where the story takes a more surprising turn. To fund their voyage, the Separatists partnered with a group of London businessmen known as the Merchant Adventurers. These were investors, not idealists. Their interest wasn't in theology, it was in profit. Colonies meant trade, land, and potential returns. In return for financing the voyage, the adventurers demanded that the new colony operate under their commercial charter and that profits would be shared. The deal was uneasy. It tied religious separatists to capitalist backers, but the Leiden congregation agreed. And to bolster the colony's strength, the adventurers insisted that additional non-separatist settlers be included on the voyage. Men with practical skills, women to grow the population, and laborers to do the hard work. The seeds of division were planted before the Mayflower ever sailed. It's easy to see these exiles as humble believers seeking peace, and many were. But the leaders among them were also politically astute. They didn't just want to survive in the New World, they wanted to govern it. The separatists had been shut out of power in England. In the New World, they could craft a society on their own terms. Their experience in Leiden taught them that without unity, foreign lands would swallow them. They envisioned tight community control, religious conformity, and self-rule. This wasn't a democracy in the modern sense. It was a theocratic ideal, a society where church and daily life were one, and dissent was unwelcome. In later years, this vision would create deep fractures, both with outsiders and among themselves. But in 1620, as the planning took shape, the dream was clear: to become the architects of a new Jerusalem in the wilderness. Originally, the settlers aimed to establish themselves in the northern part of the Virginia colony, then a vast and vaguely defined territory. Their planned destination lay near the mouth of the Hudson River, modern-day New York. This region was far enough from the existing Jamestown settlement to offer freedom, but still within the bounds of English control. To legitimize the plan, they secured a land patent from the Virginia Company. But crucially, that patent assumed they would land where they were told. They would not. Storms, poor navigation, and perhaps fate itself would throw them hundreds of miles off course. But even before they sailed, a storm of another kind was gathering between those who believed they were on a religious mission and those simply seeking land and opportunity. In the final months before departure, preparations moved quickly. Ships were purchased, first the Speedwell, which proved unseaworthy, and finally, the now famous Mayflower. The passenger list swelled to include not just the Leiden exiles, but Englishmen recruited by the merchant adventurers, craftsmen, hired hands, and families seeking a better life. Some were sympathetic to the separatist cause. Others were indifferent, or even hostile. By the time the Mayflower left England in September 1620, it carried a fragile coalition: religious exiles, secular settlers, laborers, servants, children, and ambitious men. They were united by little more than hope and necessity. The voyage ahead would test that unity to its limits. As the ship creaked into the Atlantic swell, every passenger carried a different vision of what lay ahead. For some, it was Eden. For others, a last-ditch escape from poverty or jail. For most, it was unknown. What bound them together, barely, was a shared sense that England no longer held a place for them. Whether cast out by bishops, crushed by debt, or simply hungry for land, they had chosen risk over stagnation. But that choice came with a cost. Storms awaited. Hunger awaited. Death awaited. And when the Mayflower failed to reach its destination, when legal authority vanished with the shoreline, and when chaos began to crack the hull of their unity, they would be forced to answer a question that haunts all who seek freedom. What binds us when the laws of the old world no longer apply? That question would give birth to the Mayflower Compact. But first, they had to survive the sea. They are remembered as the Pilgrims, a single, solemn group of devout men and women in black garments, bound together by faith, sailing westward for freedom. But the truth is far less tidy. The people who boarded the Mayflower in 1620 were anything but united. They were not all pious, not all English, and certainly not all pilgrims. Of the 102 passengers who stepped onto the creaking decks of the Mayflower, fewer than half were members of the separatist congregation from Leiden. These were the religious dissenters who had fled England, then Holland, and were now determined to build a godly community in the New World. But surrounding them were strangers, men and women recruited by the merchant adventurers to balance the passenger list and make the voyage financially viable. Some were skilled craftsmen, a cooper to build barrels, a blacksmith, a carpenter. Others were laborers, indentured servants, and orphans taken in for the journey. Ambitious opportunists were hoping for land or gold, widows with no better prospects, and even hired hands with no absolute loyalty to the separatists at all. There were young children, barely old enough to understand what was happening, and elderly passengers who would never see the shore again. The oldest was 64, the youngest, a baby born en route. Among them was Miles Standish, a professional soldier, not a member of the Leiden congregation, but hired for protection. There was John Alden, a cooper who joined the Voyage in Southampton. And there were indentured boys like John Billington, whose family would later cause more than one scandal in the new colony. Even the ship's crew, rough and seasoned, added their own volatile energy to the mix. They didn't come for freedom or God. They came for pay. Below deck, the living conditions erased whatever social distinctions existed on paper. Crammed into a space no larger than a modern-day three-bedroom apartment, families and strangers slept side by side. The air was thick with sweat, waste, and fear. Rats scurried in the shadows. Seasickness was constant. Tempers flared. The division between saints and strangers, as the separatists and others called each other, deepened with each passing wave. But the distinctions weren't just religious. They were economic, legal, and personal. Some passengers held legal authority through contracts or land claims. Others were mere dependents, without rights or voice. Women, as in all parts of early modern Europe, had little say in the voyage at all. Most were there because their husbands or fathers made the decision. Many were pregnant or nursing. Their quiet suffering filled the hold like a ghost no one could name. As the journey dragged on, rumors of mutiny stirred among the strangers. Why, they asked, should they obey the religious laws of people they never agreed to follow, especially when they realized the ship was not heading where it was supposed to? The original destination was near the Hudson River, within the chartered territory of the Virginia Company. But storms and miscalculation pushed the Mayflower far off course toward the unfamiliar, uncolonized edge of New England. They were landing outside legal bounds. For some, this was an opportunity. If no charter applied, who had the right to rule? Why submit to orders from separatist leaders like William Bradford or William Brewster? For the religious core, it was a threat to the entire project. Without cohesion, without structure, the fragile dream of a godly community would shatter before it even began. The Mayflower Compact would be born from this crisis, not as a bold declaration of democracy, but as a desperate patch to hold a divided group together. But before the pen touched parchment, the divisions among the passengers were already dangerous. And yet, despite all this, the passengers shared one thing: a willingness to risk everything. Whether for faith, for fortune, or for a future outside the bounds of English life, they had gambled on the Atlantic. Some would die for it. Others would kill. Many would be forgotten. But for a few short weeks, in that dark and stinking hull, they were bound together by nothing more than the sea. This is who really boarded the Mayflower. Not just pilgrims, but people. Flawed, frightened, desperate, and driven. Their reasons were different. Their visions conflicted. But together, they would become the reluctant founders of a colony that was never meant to exist, in a land they did not understand, governed by a document written in panic. History has flattened them into myth. But if we listen carefully, the human noise of that ship still echoes across the centuries, full of tension, hunger, mistrust, and fragile hope. The Mayflower slipped away from the English coast on a gray September day in 1620. There were no crowds waving farewell, No cheers or ceremony, just the clatter of ropes, the creak of timber, and the solemn faces of 102 passengers preparing to vanish into the Atlantic. They did not know it yet, but ahead of them lay 66 days of torment, disease, terror, and death. The ship itself was no vessel of hope. The Mayflower was a worn-out merchant ship, never intended for transatlantic migration. It had spent its life hauling wine and cargo along the European coast. Now, hastily converted into a people carrier, it strained under the weight of too many bodies and too little space. Below deck, where the passengers lived, the ceiling was scarcely 5 feet high. Light and air barely reached the hold. The stench of unwashed skin, vomit, excrement, and stagnant seawater clung to everything. The sick were trapped in darkness. The healthy would not remain so for long. Storms battered them early. Autumn winds off the North Atlantic came fast and violently. The ship pitched at impossible angles, sending passengers and supplies crashing into one another. One fierce storm cracked a central beam. For a time, it seemed the ship might break apart. The crew debated turning back, but one of the passengers, a clever man with a metal screw device, likely a printing press jack, managed to brace the beam. The voyage continued, but faith in the ship's integrity never fully returned. The days blurred together in a purgatory of sickness and fear. There was no fresh food, no privacy, no space. Salted meat, hard biscuits, and dried peas made up most meals. The water spoiled quickly. Rats chewed at the cargo. Lice burrowed into clothes and hair. With every crashing wave, passengers prayed not to be flung overboard or smashed against the hull. Children cried constantly. Mothers wept quietly. At least 2 pregnant women endured the rolling misery of labor in the hold. One, Elizabeth Hopkins, gave birth to a son, Oceanus, during the crossing. Another, Susanna White, would give birth shortly after landfall. But joy was fleeting. Cold crept into bones. Coughs deepened. Diarrhea spread. The ship became a floating plague house. Death came quietly at first. A young servant named William Button died before they even reached the open sea. Others followed, often buried hastily at night to avoid terrifying the remaining passengers. Bodies were sewn into blankets and slid overboard in the dark. Prayers were whispered, if spoken at all. The Atlantic swallowed the dead without ceremony. There were arguments. Separatists and strangers clashed over sleeping space, food rations, and perceived slights. The smell of rot and illness heightened every irritation. The crew, seasoned and skeptical of their pious passengers, grew contemptuous. One sailor constantly mocked the sick, saying he hoped to throw them overboard. Weeks later, he was among the first to die. Worse than the disease was the uncertainty. No one knew exactly where they were. Navigation was crude. Storms often drove them off course. They had hoped for a 4 to 5 week voyage. By week 8, panic had begun to set in. Some passengers feared they'd never see land again. Others feared mutiny. They kept calendars by marking the ship's timbers. They sang psalms to break the silence. They tried, when they could, to hold worship. But even the most faithful found their resolve weakening. William Bradford would later write that many gave up hope entirely. Only the presence of their children and the pressure of the group kept them from despair. On calm days, passengers were allowed above deck in small groups. For a few moments, they could breathe fresh air and see the open sea. But it was no comfort. The vastness of the ocean reminded them how truly alone they were. Sharks sometimes followed the ship, drawn by waste or rumor of the dead. Even the sky seemed hostile. Clouds hung low, winds howled through the rigging, and when rain came, it was cold and endless. And then, in late November, after more than 2 months adrift, the lookout cried land. It was not the place they had planned, not the fertile shores near the Hudson River, where their patent from the Virginia Company permitted them to settle. Instead, they had landed far to the north, on the jagged, windswept edges of Cape Cod. It was unfamiliar, unclaimed, and unforgiving. For a moment, there was joy, but it did not last. Without legal authority in this territory, the group faced a new crisis. The strangers among them, those outside the religious congregation, argued they were under no one's rule. If they were not in Virginia, then no English law applied. Why submit to any leader at all? The ship was still at sea, anchored in a cold bay, but already their fragile unity was breaking apart. The discussions became heated. Some threatened to go their own way. Others demanded action. It was clear, unless something changed, this group would collapse into chaos the moment they set foot ashore. And so, still aboard the Mayflower, rocking in the frigid Atlantic swell, a document was drafted, not in glory, but in fear. A short agreement signed by 41 adult men to form a civil body politic. It would come to be known as the Mayflower Compact. It bound them to act by common consent, to make and obey laws for the good of the colony. It was not a constitution, it was a truce. The compact kept them from splitting apart, but it could not erase the trauma of the voyage. They were still weak, still sick, and still terrified. The land ahead was wooded, cold, and unknown. Winter was already beginning. Food was scarce. The native inhabitants, still unseen, could appear at any time. And behind them, there was no going back. Of the 102 passengers who boarded the Mayflower, nearly half would not survive the first winter on land. But that suffering began here, on the sea. 66 days of violent motion, unbearable filth, and gnawing doubt. The voyage was not a sacred pilgrimage. It was a brutal test of endurance. Yet somehow, they endured. History would remember them as calm, orderly, united in purpose. But the truth remains etched into the wood and wind of that ship. They were scared, splintered, and exhausted. What bound them was not destiny, but desperation. What carried them was not faith alone, but the simple, stubborn refusal to die. The Mayflower, that battered merchant ship, had become something else entirely, a crucible. The people who stepped ashore in the New World were not the same as those who left England. They had already been reshaped by salt, by loss, by the groaning hull beneath their feet. And the world they were about to enter would ask even more of them. The Mayflower rocked gently in the cold waters off Cape Cod as a pale morning broke over the horizon. Land. After 66 days of chaos and rot, it should have been a moment of triumph. But the shoreline they faced was no promised land. It was the wrong land entirely. They had aimed for the mouth of the Hudson River, a region claimed by the Virginia Company, where their charter would have granted them the right to settle and govern. But storms, navigational errors, or perhaps a deliberate decision by the ship's captain had forced them hundreds of miles north. Now they were staring at a barren coastline they had never planned to see, much less inhabit. They had no patent for this place, no legal authority, no permission. Nothing in writing bound them to any law or protection. For the men and women aboard, it was as if they had landed outside of the English world entirely. A blank map, a dangerous freedom. Tensions, already stretched thin during the voyage, began to snap. Some of the strangers, those not part of the religious congregation, argued openly that they owed no loyalty to anyone. Without the structure of English governance, each man could do as he pleased. Why should they follow the will of religious exiles? Why obey anyone at all? Mutiny, long whispered below deck, now loomed like a storm of its own. With no common law and no central leadership, the colony could fracture before it even began. It was in this moment of panic that the passengers did something extraordinary. Not because they were inspired, but because they were desperate. They drafted a brief, plain document that would hold them together. Not a constitution, not a utopian plan, just a compact. An agreement to create a body politic, to make decisions collectively, and to obey the rules they themselves would choose. Authority in this remote and lawless place would rest not in a king, but in their shared consent. 41 adult men signed it. Merchants, farmers, artisans, separatists, and servants, names that would echo through history. William Bradford, William Brewster, John Carver, Edward Winslow. Even Miles Standish, the hired military officer, signed on. Some did so reluctantly. Others understood they had little choice. Survival depended on unity. The Mayflower Compact, as it came to be known, was not a revolution. It did not guarantee freedom or equality. Women had no voice in it. Servants still obeyed masters. But it marked something subtle and powerful, a shift in the source of authority. For the first time in the English colonial world, governance would not be handed down by a distant monarch. It would be negotiated on the edge of the world, among men forced to depend on one another. And still, they had not set foot on land. The first attempts to go ashore were cautious. In mid-November, a small group launched from the ship in a creaking shallop, barely seaworthy after long storage. The explorers landed near what is now Provincetown Harbor. Cold winds sliced through their clothing. Snow dusted the dunes. The forests pressed in around them, dark and silent. But the land was not empty. Almost immediately, they found evidence of indigenous presence, footprints in the soil, buried corn, graves. They stole the corn, desperate for food. They opened the graves, driven by curiosity and a belief that these were heathen burials. They took tools and artifacts, noting them in journals as strange but applicable. Some offered prayers, others simply looted. To them, this was survival. But for the people who lived there, the Nauset and Wampanoag, these were acts of desecration. Still, no one was seen. The native inhabitants had vanished from sight, but not from the woods. Watching from behind trees and ridgelines, they tracked the newcomers. These were not the first Europeans to arrive here. Decades of slavers and fishermen had already brought disease and violence to the coast. Entire villages had been wiped out in previous years by what the English called plague, but it was likely a combination of smallpox and other foreign illnesses. The land looked empty to the colonists. To the survivors, it was a graveyard. The scouting party returned to the Mayflower shaken. They knew now they were being watched. The forest was alive with eyes, but still, they had no suitable place to build. The shorelines were sandy and exposed. Fresh water was scarce. Days passed. They tried again. Another expedition, deeper inland, farther south. On December 8th, a larger group set off across Cape Cod Bay. The cold was brutal. Ice coated their clothing. Some men collapsed with cramps and exhaustion. But on December 11th, they landed at a site with better promise. Cleared fields, a stream of clean water, and an elevated hill for defense. The English would call it Plymouth. The fields had once belonged to a Wampanoag village called Patuxet, which had been wiped out by disease several years earlier. The land, seemingly open, had in fact been the heart of a thriving community. Now, the dead left no one to resist. On December 16th, the Mayflower anchored in Plymouth Harbor. The passengers were prepared to disembark. There was no ceremony, No triumphant landing, just the slow, painful offloading of supplies and people, weakened by weeks of illness and cold. Snow fell steadily. Winter was already deep. There were no houses, no food stores, no shelter. The trees were thick, the air bit like knives, and as they began to build, they began to die. The panic that had gripped them on arrival now gave way to something worse: silence. One by one, passengers fell sick. Pneumonia, dysentery, tuberculosis, exposure. The same diseases that had followed them across the Atlantic now devoured them on land. Within weeks, entire families were gone. Children lost both parents. Neighbors buried mothers. Graves were dug in frozen ground, covered quickly to hide the actual toll from native eyes. The settlers feared attack. The irony was brutal. They feared the very people whose corn they had eaten, whose graves they had robbed, and whose land they now occupied. By the end of that first winter, nearly half the Mayflower passengers were dead. But even as death swept through the settlement, something strange was happening. The alliance they feared, between the strangers and the separatists, had held. The Mayflower Compact, hastily written in desperation, had not broken. They buried their dead together. They guarded the unfinished settlement together. They prayed, argued, hunted, and built together. The colony that rose in those months was not the one they planned. It was smaller, weaker, traumatized, but it was still alive. And in the spring, when a tall Wampanoag man named Samoset walked into their settlement and greeted them in broken English, the story of Plymouth would change again, shaped not just by Europeans, but by the people who had been watching since the beginning. For now, though, in those first weeks on Cape Cod, the Pilgrims were not founders. They were survivors. And the land beneath their feet, stained with old blood and fresh graves, offered no certainty, only the question that had haunted them since the Mayflower first veered off course. What happens when everything you planned disappears, and you're left with only each other? The cold Atlantic pressed in from all sides as the Mayflower creaked at anchor off Cape Cod. Salted wind tore across the deck, but it was not the storm that terrified the passengers. It was the silence between them. For weeks, tensions had simmered. Whispers of mutiny, open defiance, grumblings from those who had not signed up for a religious colony, but for land, wealth, or escape. Now that they had landed far from their intended destination, the deal had, in their minds, collapsed. They were outside the boundaries of English law. And in the vacuum, chaos loomed. What bound them? Who commanded whom? Some argued they were free from any obligation. If there was no charter in New England, then there was no rule. They could leave, strike out on their own, start their own groups. In a place with no king, no company oversight, no legal structure, what was to stop them? The separatist leaders knew what was at stake. This wasn't just a disagreement. It was the unraveling of the colony before it had even begun. Winter had already arrived. Food was short. The land was unknown. Hostile divisions now posed as significant a threat as the sea ever had. William Bradford, William Brewster, and John Carver. These were not just men of faith. They were men of strategy. They understood that without unity, none of them would survive. But they also knew that demanding obedience on religious grounds wouldn't work. The strangers, the non-separatist passengers, owed them nothing. They had come for their own reasons. And now they had no legal reason to stay. And so they reached for something radical. Not a command, an agreement. It was John Carver who likely took the lead. A lay elder in the separatist congregation and the colony's first elected governor, he proposed that all adult males, regardless of religion, rank, or class, sign a common pact, a voluntary social contract. one that would create a civil body politic, bound by laws made collectively for the survival of the whole. The idea was simple, but in the context of the 17th century monarchy, it was revolutionary. They did not speak of democracy, nor of liberty as we understand it. This was not a blueprint for a republic. It was a moment of crisis management, a truce crafted in the eye of fear. But what it represented was astonishing. The idea that government could emerge not from a throne or a bishop's pulpit, but from mutual consent. The language was plain, even humble. We whose names are underwritten do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves into a civil body politic, to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. 41 men signed it, separatists, strangers, gentlemen, tradesmen, laborers. Some could barely write. Others flourished their names with pride. Those who refused or hesitated were quickly persuaded. There was no alternative. No signing, no protection, no survival. Women did not sign, nor did children, nor the indentured servants. The compact, like all early colonial agreements, was limited in scope. It was made by men who believed themselves to be the natural holders of power. But even within those limits, it marked a quiet revolution. This was government by necessity. And in many ways, that made it more powerful. It was not drawn from theory or abstract philosophy. It was hammered out by people who had suffered together, buried their dead together, and now faced an alien winter with no guarantee of food or shelter. The compact was not noble. It was raw, and that gave it strength. The Mayflower Compact did not lay out policies or systems. It did not create branches of government or list rights. But it did establish one thing with absolute clarity: that this group of settlers would submit to laws they created together. This was not English law. This was not church doctrine. This was governance forged at the edge of empire in the absence of empire. A temporary pact, yes, but one that echoed with ideas that would reverberate far beyond Plymouth. In later generations, Americans would point back to it as the seed of democracy, a forerunner to the Constitution, the beginning of the American idea. But for the men signing it on that cold morning in 1620, there were no grand visions, only cold, hunger, and fear of collapse. The compact was read aloud aboard the ship. No witnesses but themselves. No approval from London. No seal of any company. Yet it held. The moment it was signed, the conflict shifted. There would be no mutiny, at least not yet. Disputes would be settled by the council. A governor would be elected. All men who signed would agree to obey the laws passed by the group, so long as they remained within the bounds of the agreement. In a world ruled by kings and ordained by churches, this was quietly astonishing. A government formed without permission. The first election was held immediately. John Carver was chosen as governor. It was symbolic. Carver had helped organize the voyage, handled negotiations, and served as a stabilizing voice. But it was also practical. He was respected by both factions. His leadership would help soothe the edges of dissent. Carver governed only briefly. He died within months of landfall. But the precedent was set. The colony would elect its leaders, not inherit them. The compact was never meant to last forever. As the colony grew, new laws and institutions would take shape. Later charters would replace it. But its legacy persisted, less in its content than in its creation. It represented the first time that settlers in the New World deliberately created a form of self-government not imposed from above. It drew from the separatists' experience of congregational decision-making in Leiden. It reflected the English habit of town councils and mutual oaths. But more than anything, it was born of necessity. And necessity, in the vacuum of law, is where radical ideas are often born. They had left England fearing tyranny. They had crossed the Atlantic, fearing death. And now they face the wilderness not as servants of a monarch, but as members of a fragile, self-made polity. The Mayflower Compact didn't guarantee success. It didn't save them from the starvation and disease that would soon follow, but it gave them something critical: order, a frame, however thin, to hang survival upon. In the end, what mattered was not the words they wrote, but the choice they made to bind themselves to one another rather than break apart. That choice would define not just Plymouth, but the future of the American experiment. The forest was still. Snow clung to the edges of the trees. The men from the Mayflower moved slowly, muskets in hand, eyes darting between shadows. Every step they took was a trespass. Every breath is a gamble. They had landed in a land they did not understand, and though they had seen no people, they knew they were not alone. The first contact between the Pilgrims and the indigenous peoples of the region did not begin with words. It started with footprints. Narrow, straight, deliberate, tracking parties through the woods. Then came signs of habitation: bark-covered shelters, broken tools, corn storage pits, some abandoned, others not. Then came the graveyards, rows of mounded earth marked with stones or shells. The English, desperate and emboldened by righteousness, dug them up. They had come in search of food, but what they took was far more than sustenance. They brought baskets of maize, buried for the winter by the Nauset and Wampanoag. They took cooking vessels, tools, and even burial ornaments. To the colonists, this was God's providence. To the native people, it was desecration. No retaliation came at first, only silence. But it was not peace. The local nations had already suffered an unimaginable catastrophe. Between 1616 and 1619, European diseases swept through these coastal villages, killing up to 90% of some populations. Entire communities vanished. Patuxet, the town that once stood where Plymouth would rise, lay empty, its survivors dead or scattered. The English believed they had been led to a prepared land. In truth, they had stumbled into a ghost world left behind by epidemic and mourning. But not everyone was gone. From the tree line, the survivors watched. They observed the settlers' movements, numbers, tools, and weapons. They studied their habits, their campfires, their waste. They listened to their arguments. They began to learn their weaknesses. The English, for all their armor and muskets, were starving, disoriented, and sick. This was not an invasion force. It was a broken flock. The Wampanoag Confederacy, led by Massasoit, was already weighing options. The arrival of these strange people, with their steel and disease, could tip the balance of power in the region. The neighboring Narragansett had grown stronger. The Wampanoag were still reeling from losses. The English were feared, but also seen as potential leverage. Still, contact was dangerous, and every move had to be calculated. Meanwhile, the settlers began to realize they were being watched. In early December, as they searched for a permanent site, a group of armed men marched inland, following trails that led past abandoned settlements. One night, as they slept near a creek, they were attacked, not by a war party, but by a small group of warriors testing their resolve. It was quick. Arrows hissed from the trees. The English scrambled for muskets, firing wildly into the darkness. No one on either side was killed. But the message was clear: you are not invisible, and you are not welcome. The settlers called it the first encounter. But it was not a meeting. It was a warning. They returned to the Mayflower shaken. The forest had become a battlefield in waiting. Every tree might hide an enemy. They posted guards. They built a palisade. They buried their dead at night so as not to reveal their losses. They kept muskets loaded. And yet, they still had no idea who they were dealing with. The native nations of the region, the Wampanoag, Nauset, Narragansett, Massachusetts, and others, had complex political structures, alliances, and rivalries. Some had been trading with Europeans for years. Others had been enslaved and taken to Europe. They were not primitive tribes in chaos. They were calculating survivors navigating the aftermath of a catastrophe. The English knew none of this. To them, all were savages, faceless, voiceless, unpredictable. They often spoke of divine guidance, but inwardly they were terrified. Then, in March, something strange happened. A tall man entered the Plymouth settlement, walking boldly into the center of town. He was alone, unarmed, and smiling. He raised his hand and said in halting but clear English, "Welcome." His name was Samoset. He was an Abenaki from what is now Maine, visiting the Wampanoag, and he had picked up some English from fishermen along the coast. The settlers stared in disbelief. After months of silence, surveillance, and fear, a native man had walked straight into their midst and spoken their language. Samoset did not stay long. But he returned days later with another man, a figure who would become central to the colony's survival. Tisquantum. The English called him Squanto. His story was unlike any other. Born in Patuxet, he had been kidnapped by an English explorer, sold into slavery in Spain, escaped to England, and eventually returned to his homeland, only to find it wiped out by disease. He was a man between worlds, fluent in English, familiar with European ways, but still a Wampanoag by heritage and allegiance. Through Squanto, communication began. Messages were sent to Massasoit. Meetings were proposed. The settlers, unsure but desperate, agreed. A treaty would be negotiated. But that was still ahead. For now, what mattered was this. The silence had broken. The people in the trees had names. They had languages. They had reasons. And they were not afraid to make themselves known. The settlers had survived first contact not through strength, but through mercy. And even then, it was clear that mercy had limits. He stepped into the clearing with quiet authority. Tall, composed, face painted in traditional red ochre, he was flanked by warriors, armed, silent, alert. This was not a welcoming party. This was a calculated arrival. His name was Ausamaquin, though the English would call him Massasoit. He was the sachem, the paramount leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy. And he had not come to Plymouth as a friend. He had come as a strategist. It was March of 1621. The snow was thawing. The English, now calling their settlement Plymouth, were still reeling from winter. Nearly half of their original number had died. Men, women, children. The survivors were weak, many sick, most terrified. They had food for only a few weeks. Their houses were unfinished. They lacked tools, knowledge of the land, and the means to plant or hunt effectively. And now, a delegation of native leaders stood before them, watching, assessing. Massasoit had every reason to drive them out, or to let them die. These were not his people. These were intruders. They had robbed his kin's graves, stolen corn, and taken land abandoned only because European disease had ravaged the coast. They were settlers of a foreign empire, one that, in time, might flood the region with more ships, more steel, more death. And yet, he had not come to make war. To understand why, one must understand what Massasoit saw. A decade earlier, his people had numbered in the tens of thousands. Dozens of villages lined the coast. The Wampanoag controlled fertile land and had a long-standing influence in the region. Then came the plagues, carried not by armies, but by fishermen, traders, and explorers. The sicknesses struck with biblical force. Villages like Patuxet were annihilated. Entire families vanished in days. The Wampanoag were shattered, but not all their neighbors were. To the west, the Narragansett tribe had emerged from the epidemic stronger and more intact. Their warriors were numerous, their ambitions rising. Massasoit's position was growing fragile. His people, once dominant, now watched their influence slip. He needed allies, not just for trade, but for survival. The English were dangerous, but they were also desperate. They had muskets, tools, and ships. They could not be conquered easily, but they could be made useful. So when Samoset and Tisquantum returned to Plymouth to open dialogue, it was not a spontaneous gesture of peace. It was political reconnaissance. Massasoit had sent them to evaluate. Could these strangers be trusted? Were they too weak to matter, or just weak enough to need him? The answer was yes. They needed him, more than they could admit. The meeting took place under heavy watch. On one side, Massasoit and his warriors. On the other hand, Governor John Carver, William Bradford, and Miles Standish, surrounded by men clutching loaded muskets. They met in an open field between the woods and the sea. Gifts were exchanged: knives, beads, and tobacco. They sat. They spoke through Squanto, whose command of English made him indispensable. Then came the treaty. It was a simple agreement, written quickly, forged in necessity. Each side promised not to harm the other. If one were attacked, the other would aid in defense. Neither would steal from the other. Disputes would be settled through proper channels. In truth, it was more of a truce than an alliance. There was no promise of friendship, only coexistence. Still, it was a turning point. For the English, the treaty offered something priceless: time. They could now begin planting, fishing, building, without fear of imminent attack. For Massasoit, it provided a buffer against the Narragansett. The English might be few in number, but their weapons were formidable, and their presence destabilizing. Better to have them as uneasy neighbors than as unpredictable enemies, or worse, pawns of his rivals. But the treaty also locked both sides into a fragile dependency. Massasoit allowed Squanto to remain with the Colonists, not as a gesture of goodwill, but to serve as his eyes and ears. Squanto had his own motives. Having lost his entire village, he now carved out a role as mediator, translator, and political actor. He taught the settlers how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer, how to find eels in the mud, and how to interpret signs in the forest. Without him, the colony might not have lasted another season. But even Squanto's loyalty was a shifting thing. Over time, he began manipulating both sides, elevating his own status by exaggerating threats, forging alliances, and undermining rivals. He became both a savior and a schemer, walking a tightrope between cultural worlds. For now, though, the English were grateful. Crops began to grow. Trade resumed. The woods grew less threatening. They even began to repair their defenses, not in haste, but in planning. The alliance held. But beneath the surface, everyone was watching. Everyone remembered what had been taken, and everyone understood that peace, once broken, could never be made again. In the spring, Governor Carver died suddenly. The leadership passed to William Bradford, a younger, steadier, and more politically cautious man. Under him, the colony took on a more rigid structure. The The compact remained in force. Decisions were made collectively. Relations with the Wampanoag remained formally peaceful. But even Bradford knew how tenuous it all was. One spark could undo everything. One raid, one theft, one misunderstanding. And so the alliance became not a friendship, but a balance of power, fragile and full of consequence. Years later, when war did come, it would be devastating. Native alliances would fracture. The children of these first leaders would turn on one another. Towns would burn. Treaties would be dust. But in 1621, for one season, the balance held. Massasoit returned to his people. The English returned to their crops. And in that brief window, between the starving time and the coming fire, a settlement and a confederacy stood side by side, not in harmony, but in strategic silence. It was not trust. It was not peace. It was something older, colder, and more real. It was politics. The harvest was in. Not abundant, but enough. Enough to hold off hunger. Enough to face the coming winter without the certainty of death. After a year of shipwrecked expectations, improvised alliances, and bitter cold, the settlers at Plymouth were alive. That alone felt like a miracle. It was November 1621. For the first time since stepping onto the shores of the New World, the English could breathe without dread. Crops had grown: corn, squash, beans. Thanks mainly to Wampanoag instruction, the fishing had improved. There were now sturdier houses, a fort, a palisade, and there were fewer mouths to feed. Half of the original passengers had died. It was not a celebration of abundance. It was a moment of reprieve, a pause in the storm. William Bradford described it briefly in his journals. Edward Winslow mentioned it with more detail. A 3-day gathering, feasting with many of the Indians coming amongst us. But there was no mention of turkeys carved at the table, no long trestles of pies, no pious speeches beneath fluttering banners. The story that would become the first Thanksgiving was still just a footnote, barely noticed by those who lived it. Yet it happened, or something like it. After the harvest, Governor Bradford ordered a celebratory firing of muskets and cannons, a signal of survival, perhaps, or of pride. Nearby Wampanoag heard the explosions and arrived soon after, Massasoit himself, along with 90 men. Not a formal invitation, not a planned feast, a sudden diplomatic gathering, armed and alert. But there was no bloodshed. Instead, they joined. They brought venison, corn, and game birds. The English cooked their meager stores. The gathering lasted 3 days. They ate. They competed in foot races and shooting matches. They watched each other closely. Beneath every gesture of fellowship, there was calculation. For the Wampanoag, it was a chance to reinforce the alliance, to observe how strong or weak their new neighbors were, to remind the English that they were not the only power in the region. For the colonists, it was a chance to display strength, to show that they were organized, fortified, and capable. There was no religious ceremony, no sermon, no holiday. The English had long practiced days of Thanksgiving in times of drought or war, usually marked by fasting and prayer, not feasting. This was not that. This was diplomacy with food. And yet, it would become the seed of a national myth. Not because of what it was, but because of what it would be made to represent. In time, this fleeting event, a brief intersection of survival and strategy, would be recast as a founding moment of unity, friendship, and divine blessing. But there was a forgotten half to that story. Most of the English women were already dead. Of the roughly 18 adult women who had boarded the Mayflower, only 4 were still alive by the fall of 1621. They had buried their own children, husbands, and sisters. And yet it was they who cooked, served, and sustained the fragile veneer of order during that gathering. Their names were seldom recorded. Their labor is taken for granted. Their pain is invisible. There were children too, some orphaned, others born into the chaos. They ran between the feet of warriors and settlers, perhaps unaware of how delicate the peace truly was. These were the ones who would grow up never knowing England, shaped instead by the forests of this new world, raised in the flickering shadow between cultures that would soon clash. And there were the servants, men and boys who had signed no compact, held no vote, but bore the same cold, the same hunger, the same fears. They too had survived, but they would be remembered not by name, but by category. The Wampanoag had their own forgotten voices, the women who did not attend, the elders who watched from afar, the warriors who buried their own kin in the wake of the plagues. Their view of this strange meal, this peculiar alliance, was not one of celebration. It was cautious, measured, and wary. They had already seen what English ships brought: sickness, steel, and settlers who never left. And yet, for one fleeting moment, they sat together, not as equals, not as friends, but as people are bound by circumstance. One group is facing extinction, the other, exhaustion. There were no declarations of eternal peace, no shared political vision. No gratitude was offered to each other. There was only food, hunted, cooked, traded, shared. A table drawn in the mud of compromise at the edge of a world none of them could control. Years later, as colonial expansion devoured land and treaties collapsed, the memory of that gathering would become useful. A symbol, a fiction, a sanitized origin story that erased conflict, erased conquest, erased the messy truth. Thanksgiving would be declared a holiday, first by George Washington, then codified by Lincoln during the Civil War, as a unifying narrative. The Pilgrims would be cast as gentle refugees, the natives as willing helpers. It was a myth built to heal, but also to forget. But in 1621, none of that existed. No flags, no holiday, just a fragile truce and a shared hunger. This was not a story of unity. It was a story of survival. And survival, in the end, is never clean. The winter passed. The graves froze over, then thawed. The palisade stood firm. Crops were planted again. A new ship arrived, Fortune, in November 1621, bringing more settlers but no supplies. The English at Plymouth braced for another year, not of founding a nation, but of simply staying alive. They did not yet know what they were building. To them, it was a fragile experiment, held together by daily labor, nightly prayer, and the unspoken awareness that death had come close, far too close to ending it all. But in time, what they began as a desperate colony would be remembered as something far greater, not by those who lived it, but by those who came after. The Mayflower passengers did not call themselves Pilgrims. That word, so central to the American myth, was rarely used by the settlers themselves. It came much later, popularized in the 1800s, when historians and ministers began shaping the rough edges of the past into something smoother, nobler, something patriotic. By then, Plymouth had long been absorbed by larger and wealthier colonies. It never became a significant power. It was overshadowed by Boston, eclipsed by commerce, absorbed by history. And yet, as the United States struggled to define its origins, especially after the Civil War, the Mayflower rose again, not as a ship, but as a symbol. It was convenient. The Mayflower carried families. It landed in New England. It had a document, the Compact, that could be retrofitted into a democratic origin story. It had a harvest, it had a feast, and it had just enough distance from slavery, from Jamestown's brutality, from southern plantations, to serve as a clean beginning. Politicians leaned into it. Thanksgiving was formalized. Paintings were commissioned. Textbooks told of peaceful Indians and pious pilgrims. The violent years that followed, the wars, the betrayals, the massacres, were softened or ignored entirely. What had been a complex story of survival, diplomacy, and mistrust became a tale of shared values. America, it was said, was founded on cooperation and faith, on freedom of religion, on a common purpose. The Mayflower Compact was taught as a proto-constitution. The first Thanksgiving became a moment of national unity. But history is not myth, and the true legacy of 1620 does not lie in costumes or parades. It lies in contradiction. The settlers came seeking religious freedom, but later denied it to others. They signed a compact for self-rule, but enforced strict conformity. They made peace with Massasoit, then watched future generations break every promise. Their survival depended on indigenous knowledge, yet their descendants drove those same people from their lands. The Mayflower story is not a straight line. It is a knot of ideals and failures, of courage and blindness, of hope tangled with harm. Yet perhaps that is what makes it worth remembering, not as a tale of saints, but of people. Ordinary people. Some devout, some reckless. Some are ambitious, some terrified. They crossed an ocean not knowing what waited. They argued. They sickened. They grieved. They built. They broke. And they endured, not because they were heroes, but because they had no other choice. The women who went nameless in the records cooked, nursed, and buried their children. The servants who signed nothing still helped raise houses and harvest crops. The native leaders who weighed alliance over annihilation shaped the balance of power in ways still misunderstood. They were all part of it, yet most were forgotten. The legacy of Plymouth is not a single day in November. It is the unresolved tension between what America tells itself and what it refuses to confront. The Mayflower Compact hinted at democracy, but only for some. The Thanksgiving gathering hinted at peace, but it came in the shadow of plague and power. If there is meaning in the Mayflower, it is not in the myth. It is in the mirror it offers, a reflection of how nations remember beginnings, with pride, but also with omission, with symbols, but also with silence. Today, descendants of those first Wampanoag still live in the region. For many of them, Thanksgiving is not a celebration, but a day of mourning, a reminder of what was lost after the treaties were broken, the land seized, the culture suppressed, and yet the memory remains, too powerful to ignore. Plymouth still draws visitors. The replica ship still sails. The compact still hangs in books and museums. And every year, people gather at long tables, speak of gratitude, and invoke a moment that was never meant to be history, only survival. But perhaps there is something valuable in returning to the truth, not to destroy the myth, but to ground it, to replace the simplicity of sainthood with the complexity of people. Because if we can see them as they were, hungry, frightened, flawed, we might see ourselves more clearly. We might recognize that all foundations are imperfect, that democracy often begins not with high ideals, but with cold desperation, that peace is not given, it is negotiated, that memory, like the Mayflower itself, must be maintained with care, or else it sinks beneath the weight of what we prefer to believe. And so the story ends, not with a feast, not with a prayer, but with a question. What do we owe to the past, not as myth, but as truth?